Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ross Petrou. I'm the Managing Principal of Crow Horwath in our northern region, which includes, of course, South Queensland. Earlier this year, Crow Horwath joined the Findex Group, and tonight, on behalf of Findex Management, we welcome clients, referring partners and friends of our firm and our family of businesses, which includes Centric Wealth, Financial Index Wealth Accountants and Crow Horwath. We value the relationships and the opportunity we have to work with you to help you achieve your goals. We've invited you here this evening because we regard you as special friends who've been very supportive over many years, as well as more recent times. We enjoy working with you, and hopefully you enjoy working with us, so much so that you will refer more of your friends to us so that we can help them. You are why we exist as a business, and working with you is what drives us every day. Tonight provides us with an opportunity to say thank you for your support and for your trust in our ability to deliver. We have a number of your trusted advisors here with us this evening, and I'm sure they will be able to continue to provide you with the highest level of service in an increasingly complex and ever-changing world. And I thank them for the commitment that they show to managing your affairs. In addition to my role at Crow Horwath, I'm also the trustee of our Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, Quagoma. And I'd like to welcome Professor Susan Street, AO, our board chair, and some of the team from Quagoma here this evening, who are taking the break from the hectic proceedings at the 8th Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art, otherwise known as APT8, to view this exhibition tonight as friends of Crow Horwath. So without wanting to steal too much of the show from my colleague John Ives from Ballarat, who will be your Master of Ceremonies this evening, Reflections of Lost Diggers of Vineyard Court is artist George Petrou's expressions based on a trove of photographs of Australian soldiers taken during World War I in Vineyard Court by local photographer of the day, Louis Thuia. Welcome to you, George, and I look forward to hearing your stories. We hope you'll enjoy this evening, and now I'd like to hand over to John Ives, our Senior Financial Advisor from Financial Index Wealth Accountants.
Dean Mile, who was in the Commando Regiment, and some of you may know Dean more fully in his days as the Secretary of the Electrical Trades Union. Dean's personal story of discovery, I think, is inspirational, and it shows the commitment that one man can have to trying to find a mate. It wasn't a mate from 100 years ago, but he's become his mate. Could you please welcome Dean to the stage to tell me about his personal story of discovery? Thanks, Dean.
This is an act of remembrance, really. The paintings that George has done, his interpretation of the wonderful images of those boys taken nearly 100 years ago, I think it's just absolutely marvellous act of remembrance on behalf of George. I'm not sure where George and his wife are, somewhere out there. Just there. They are. Beautiful work, George. Absolutely glorious. And just on another note, I think what a wonderful act by Kerry Stokes to have secured those glass plates and to have given them to the Australian Memorial, as he's inclined to do. Yeah, it's a wonderful, beautiful thing to do. And he's done that on many occasions. And enormous respect for that. You know, you could see in his emotion, in his voice, just how much remembrance meant to him. And I know they cost him a heck of a lot of money. He's got a bit. Do Findex look after him, John? Oh, I bet you wish you did. You might. I hope you do. The digger I want to talk about tonight is Edward John Falloon. And he is captured beautifully by George on my right there. And he was regimental number 27, and he signed up at the very first opportunity he could to go to war in 1914. He is an interesting character. Born in Richmond, lived in Richmond in Victoria, and he was an electrician by trade, and that's how I came to know of him. At my time with the Electrical Trades Union, we wanted to do something to recognise those soldiers who were members of ours who had served. How could we do that? And we started upon a history project of methodically researching every member against the AOF database and mapping those who served. And I took, for some reason I can't explain exactly why, I took an interest in Tiny Falloon. We didn't have a picture of him. We didn't know what he looked like. We knew what he did. We were able to research his military records, and I'll tell you a little about them in a minute. Prior to the war, we know that Tiny Falloon served in the civilian military forces on submarines. What's really interesting is his enlistment records show that he was between 6'2" and 6'4". Now in 1914, that is one big bloke. And you can guess what his mates called him, being an Aussie? Tiny. So imagine Tiny trying to fit in the old AE1 or AE2 submarines. And when he signed up to go full-time, they gave him the rank of Lance Corporal. And he was a big, powerful man, a big man. And his family, who I've come to know, and I'll tell you about how that happened in a minute, the history of him is that passed down through his sister Kate onto his niece Leslie, was that he was a swashbuckling type. I'm going to look at him and I reckon he might have been a swashbuckling type back in 1940. Would have dominated, definitely played in the ruck in footy, for sure. He enlisted in the 2nd Field Company Engineers. And he worked for the Melbourne City Council. So when he'd signed up and he was going to war, the Melbourne City Council saw fit to present Tiny, and I don't mind referring to Tiny, with a gift. So what would you give a young 6'4" swashbuckling type who's going to go to war? Well, you give him a silver teapot set, wouldn't you? And to which his niece Leslie has to this day, and that beautiful lady, it always moves me to watch that every time I see it. The lovely lady in that video you just saw is Leslie Falloon. That's Tiny's niece. Now, Leslie is... She's no way known this will get back to Leslie, is there, John? Leslie's 95. Now, I'm not talking about women and ages. Leslie's 95, fit as a fiddle, sharp, and only a little deaf. But she still has his teapot that he was presented to him back from then. But a little bit about Tiny the soldier. He was among the first to land with the 2nd Field Company Engineers at Gallipoli. And very, very early on, he was recommended twice for bravery. Now, the job of an engineer in the context of the First World War was to be at the front line when our boys took trenches. The engineers would be there under fire, under shell fire, rifle fire, and very close presence to the enemy at Lone Pine to actually shore up the defences to protect the troops, enable them to defend or to attack. And 2 separate officers recommended this big fella for bravery, and he was awarded the military medal for his gallantry at Lone Pine. He survived Gallipoli and wasn't evacuated off the peninsula. Most of the boys got crook or something. Tiny seemed to tough it out, and then of course went back and ended up in France. And in all, during his war service, young Tiny was recommended for bravery 5 times. Never once for acts under arms, attacking an enemy, but on every occasion looking after the welfare of the men. At Bapaume in France, he was awarded the military medal yet again for exposing himself under 300 yards of open ground when his men were constructing the road. He saw that some of the boys under his command were left exposed. The road was being shelled by the Germans frantically with high explosives to disrupt the Australian works. And these guys were stranded, they had no cover. Well, Tiny knew where there was cover, so he ran 300 yards and guided the men to where there was a dugout and saved their life. And you can imagine high explosive artillery landing all around you, and he did that. And he would be recommended again and again. But he was recognised twice, and so he has the military medal and bar as his decorations. And I might have a little picture of this. I'm not good at this. There they are. They're the decorations that Tiny got. And the medal on the left is his military medal, and it was presented to him by General Birdwood in the field in France. His very first one, not the bar, but the first one was. So he would have had that on him, and he would have kept that on him amongst his possessions throughout the war. He would have gone to rest, like many of the boys did at Vignacourt, where these photographs were taken. It was about 35 miles behind the line, and if you look at Tiny there, George has painted him at the age of 27. And if you look at the eyes, which are such a wonderful I suppose, interpretation of exactly what he was like. It's exactly like the image of him. The eyes look like he's about 50. And he had, by that time, survived Gallipoli, survived numerous actions on the Western Front, and he survived Pozieres. And within a square mile of the little high ground that was the village of Pozieres in France, which I've been to several times, we had over 26,000 casualties, Australian casualties, within about a 7 or 8 week period. The Pozieres Moke Farm, ground that we fought over, there was no recognisable front line, the trench systems were all blown away, the carnage was immense. And all of the First World War diggers that would come home, they talk about their worst experiences of the war, generally would agree, the Pozieres, the shelling and the absolute horrific, barbaric conditions there would be the worst that they've seen. Bad too, later in the war, no war was good. None of the warfare on the Western Front was good, but Pozieres was tragic for Australians. And bear in mind, in 1916, earlier in that year, Australians were sent over open ground in a daylight raid on Fromelles. And we suffered 5,500 casualties that day, 19th of July 1916, 5,500. I mean, this was our first major encounter since the boys had come off Gallipoli. And, you know, we lost over 8,000 there. So this was a massive mismanagement of war, disregard for human life by British generals in what was a diversion. Pozieres was just an absolute brutal attrition, and Tiny survived that. So by the time he would have rested, and by his sergeant stripes that are on his shoulder, we would know that that would have been taken late 1916, following his military records, and when he was promoted to sergeant with the 2nd Field Company Engineers, and he would have gone behind the lines. And you don't really blame him for smiling, but then again, I guess swashbuckling types aren't prone to smile. He would have seen a bit, and even though in these wonderful images that the Tuileries took of the Australian soldiers, there are some smiles, but if you look at the eyes, the smiles aren't really quite there in those images. But Tiny, at that point in time, by late 16, 17, had proved himself a very effective leader, a very, very effective soldier. He was tapped on the shoulder to go to England and firm up a new pioneering company called the Australian First Troop Company, and he was enlisted as the company sergeant major. Now, this fella has tapped me on the shoulder about remembrance in all sorts of funny ways. It was one Sunday afternoon, I was watching Channel 7, sat down, having a quiet beer, and watched this little short documentary that was about the Vigny Corps diggers and these glass slides. I'd heard about them, and this documentary was finally there, and it had interviews with Kerry Stokes and Ross Coulthard, who's done that magnificent book. And it had their interviews and footage of the old attic. The truth behind the old attic was when the farmhouse was sold and they discovered these gas plates, it was full of German World War II junk. Jerry cans and rubbish and all that sort of stuff, and in their haste to clean all this old rubbish out, there was these old chests, and of course that's where these magnificent images of the Australians were preserved. Well, I'm watching the TV show and they're flashing the images of these guys coming in and out. I'd never seen a photo of Tiny Falloon until Leslie Falloon, when I went to meet Leslie, she actually showed me one. The family had one. And when I met Leslie, and I rang her actually before I met her in basic hope that she may be related to Edward John Falloon. And when I rang her up and I said, "Oh, Leslie, you don't know me, my name's Dean Mile." I said, "Look, are you related to Edward John Falloon?" "Uncle Ned." I said, "That'd be the one." She goes, "Oh, yes." A bit deaf, Leslie. But, oh yeah, so she were having a good old natter. I went and seen her, and we ended up having a very emotional afternoon actually talking about it. And it was at that point in time I got this powerful insight into this soldier, into what he'd done from a family perspective, what they knew. And she said, "Dean, I have a photograph of him." I said, "Oh, fantastic. I wanted to put a face to this guy I'd researched." She goes, "I'm a little bit embarrassed," she said, "because I had to take his photo down in the 70s because he used to scare the grandchildren." And he had this, I'll show you the photo in a minute. He's a company sergeant major, the old Sam Brown on, no hat, and he's looking very, very mischievous indeed. So he used to scare the grandchildren, but he's now up in the offices of the Electrical Trade Union and appropriately remembered. But it was interesting that Leslie would talk about that. I'm reading a book. I wanted to read a book to tell the Falloon family a little bit about what their relative had done during the war, what was an engineer's life like during the war. And I knew of a diary written by Roy Denning, a soldier from Goulburn. He was also with the 2nd Field Company Engineers. And Roy had written a book I'd read many years before, a really great war diary, about as honest as you can get. And it went through the same battles that Tiny would have been in, Gallipoli, Pozieres in particular. And in reading that book again, prior to giving it to Leslie and her family and saying, hey, this was kind of Tiny's war, Roy Denning was, when he became a sergeant, was sent to England to be a sergeant in the Australian 1st Troop Company. And within his book, he actually says, I'm reading it a second time, in his book he says, was sent to England, he said, myself and 4 sergeants met the company sergeant major, a huge big bastard we called Tiny. And I've gone, oh, yeah, that's him, you know, and he came to me again. Roy served with Tiny throughout the duration of the war. There was another link, another story about Tiny. We had the Vignicore images, we had the book talk about him again. And in going to meet Leslie Falloon, it was funny because Leslie, very dignified lady, lovely lady, and she lives in Brighton in Melbourne, which is more of the higher class end of town, if you like. And Leslie was a former mayor and staunch Liberal Party supporter. And when I rang her up, I said to her, Leslie, I'll come from the Electrical Trades Union. She said, I don't get a lot of calls from unionists, Steve. I said, it's all right, Leslie. So we went around and we caught up and had a wonderful, wonderful chat and formed a wonderful friendship. And in talking to Leslie, I said I wanted to know from the family perspective, but I had all these military records. And the great thing about military records, all digitised now, Australian does a wonderful job of that. In the files, in Tiny's war files, are letters from his sister Kate. Sadly, Tiny was killed on the 10th of April 1918. He'd survived, you know, an enormous part of the war. He'd seen huge action, and at that time in the war, around March, April, the Germans knew the Americans were going to buy into the First World War, had 500,000 fresh troops, armed to the teeth, new artillery, and really the Germans were at that stage really beaten up by the war as well, suffering badly at home. Their soldiers had been through hell and back just like ours had. But they had one big push, one major offensive, and in that offensive, up in Belgium, just over the French border, in a little place called Ploegstert, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Tiny and his men in the 1st Troop Company were stationed up there. They were after volunteers to go and actually try and hold up the German advance so that the Allied headquarters could be evacuated. In doing so, Tiny was shot and killed very quickly. He died very quickly, and holding up that advance. His mates actually carried him back 2 kilometres to where the Allied headquarters was, and they buried him in a field. They said they didn't have time to erect a cross. We know this from reading the Red Cross reports. But they buried him, took his personal effects so that they could be shipped home. And tragically, those personal effects were on a ship called the Beruga, which was torpedoed and sunk, so the family actually got nothing at all. And when I met Leslie, she produced those medals. And it was amazing to see his military medal on the left. The others would have been sent to his family after the war, but the military medal, he'd already been presented one. Sister Kate, in the military letters and military files and Tiny's file, wrote to the army and said, you know, I lost my brother, and explained who he was. And he was awarded the military medal and bar, and his effects were lost at sea. Would it be possible for the army to replace it? The army, being the army, writes back and says, our policy is this, we're very, very sorry, but no, can't have one. So then in this letter you start to get this picture of the love of a sister for her brother, and the story becomes far more than just about a soldier. Because no story is just about a soldier. None of these boys are just soldiers. They're brothers, they're sons, they're fathers. So Kate writes this letter back to the army and says, look, you know, that's really not right. I think you should do it. Certainly, you know, he's sacrificed a lot. He sacrificed his life. The army writes back and says, no, not again, not in line with the military policy. So Kate then writes another letter to General Birdwood himself. And the letter goes on with some passion and a lot of love for her brother. And at the end of the letter, and Leslie and I are talking about this, Leslie never knew about these letters. She'd never seen them from her Aunt Kate. The end of her letter to General Birdwood says, and at what price a mother's son? Birdwood writes back and says, we will send you another military medal and bar. And so that one on the left is a bit special. Quite emotional when I saw it because I knew the history and Leslie didn't. So we're able to go over that. We had a good old cry that afternoon, I don't mind saying. And a cup of tea, magnificent Lamingtons from Leslie as well. She actually turned it on. She was pretty good. And so in that we were able to talk about her Uncle Ned, about her sister Kate, about her life after the war. And she herself was a fearsome, independent woman. So the wonderful thing about Tiny's story was that it isn't just about a soldier, and none of them. In all of our acts of remembrance and all of those Australians who have served our country at war and any war, it's never just about them, is it? There's always a bit more. So in meeting Leslie, I had told her that I'd done some research and I'd actually been to Belgium and France and tried to get an idea of where the Red Cross reports talk about where Tiny was buried by his mates, because Tiny Falloon has no known grave. Now, Tiny's like a lot of the soldiers that are missing with no known grave. They actually had a known grave that was lost, and there's a big difference. So his mates talk in the Red Cross report, we buried him 50 yards north of the road, opposite the Allied headquarters, halfway between a place called Pleugstert, where he was killed, and Ramaren. It's about 4 k's, this road. And I may be able to get it. Ah, there's Leslie. She's a rough head on the bloke on the right. We just had a unit reunion. I wish I hadn't had that haircut. But Leslie, Leslie and I, that was our day in Canberra, actually. And Leslie, because I'd identified a Tiny Falloon, I'd let the War Memorial know we found him. We could actually identify one. They invited Leslie to the War Memorial to represent the families of the missing. The Vignicord diggers were known and not known, and I went with Leslie. It was like driving Miss Daisy, actually. We had a terrific couple of days. She was the centre of attention, had the crowd spellbound. Went out, I digress a little, we went out for dinner one night, the night before the exhibition, and because Leslie's a little bit hard of hearing, you don't have a private conversation. And we're in this restaurant in this lovely hotel in Canberra, and it was loud, but I'm thinking, well, she's 94, she can be as loud as she wants, she's earned that right. And her story's a good one. By the end of the night, Leslie had no intentions of going to bed early, believe me. We had 8 people on our little table of 2, around our table of 2, listening to her story, and about Tiny, and about remembrance. And they all got it and cared enough to be a part. We had the bloody waiters sitting in, and it was a great night. Now, Leslie captured the night, and it was wonderful for her. And to see her then walk into the Vignicord Digger exhibition at the Australian War Memorial the next day, and to see her see Tiny's picture up on the wall and recognising that he did have his identity here, and he did have his name, and we knew who he was pretty touching. I think they captured it well in that video. That was pretty much as it was. So she was a ripper. But I talked to Leslie and I said, look, I think we should find Tiny Falloon. I think we should find your Uncle Ned. She goes, oh, how would you do that? And I said, well, I've walked around a couple of times now. And in going there, I had a couple of shots of that. Oh, there he is. That's the one she took down off a wall in 1970s. He used to scare the grandchildren. He did too. He's good. He would have scared the shit out of the Turks and Germans too, just by. Anyway, on a very cold and wet day, with a friend of mine, Johan van der Velde, who runs a pub in near Polygon Wood. Some of you would have heard of Polygon Wood in Belgium. Johan met a bloke in a pub, as you do, and he said he would help me as an interpreter to go and talk to the local farmers, make sure we had the right place. That field is opposite what we now know to be the Allied headquarters from the First World War, and that is looking north into the field, and you can look out and imagine 50 yards out there, and that little track, that road, I'll show you in a minute, is exactly as it was 100 years ago. Nothing much changes over there. The farmhouses don't change, nothing much changes. We managed to research and find an aerial photograph. And if you look at the building on the left, you see the road running sort of through the lower middle part of the picture with the bends in it. Well, the last sort of farmhouse in that aerial photograph on the left was the Allied headquarters throughout the First World War, for much of it, until April 11, when the Germans took it off us and we never got it back till after the war. Well, that little laneway, that little laneway there is the very one that runs out up and north into the field. It hasn't changed. The farmhouses around there haven't changed, but the shell holes are covered in. Interestingly enough, on the right-hand side of that farmhouse, there was a trench dug, and there's a trench marked in the maps, and if you go there, it is still in the ground there, snaking along as the trenches did in those days. So we went knocking on the door, Johan and I, to that farmhouse and explained our story. We said, is there anything here within the building that would tell us that this was a military installation or used by the military at some time? Young people were renting it and they actually said, oh, come with us. We went downstairs in the cellar area, and it was about that high because it had 3 foot of concrete above it and all around it. When the British had got control of that, turned it into their headquarters, they heavily fortified the cellar area and of course reduced the height. And Winston Churchill was there as well. It was part of the headquarters he used. So the Australians were up there, and that is a photograph of August of 1918. So in that field to the north, his mates buried Tiny Falloon, no cross. The Germans captured the ground. We never got it back till after the war. The Graves Recovery Unit confirmed, again through more research, a lot of research into this, that they never actually looked for anyone in that sector. So they never recovered any of our missing from that part of Belgium. If you look up the top of the picture, slightly in the middle to the left, there's a farmhouse up there. Well, as it turns out, that's the farm that actually controls the property that Tiny Falloon was buried in by his mates. So I said to Johan, well, listen, can we go and talk to the farmer, because I'd love to find a GPR, ground penetrating radar unit. Let's see if we can't find a disturbance in the ground 50 yards north of that road or thereabouts, and see if we can't give Tiny Falloon his identity, his dignity back, bury him with his mates. So up we drive up that driveway, nothing much has changed, believe me. And we pull up in the little courtyard in there, unannounced. There's all these dogs barking, mongrel things, they were too, fair dinkum. Anyway, out comes this French-speaking Belgian farmer, and he was huge. And he had the old bib and brace overalls on, white singlet, and about 4 teeth. And I'm there wearing my Aussie rugby top, thinking like it's a passport, isn't it? You know, rugby should be okay. So Johan starts a bit of a banter going with the farmer, and for about 10 minutes they're having a good old chat about what's going on. And I'm standing there thinking, give me something, just give me something. Is it okay? How are we going? You know, they're all having a good old chat, and the farmer would look at me, and then he continued talking. I thought, well, this isn't going well. And then all of a sudden, the big fella comes over to me, his hands were huge, puts his arm around, I get a big hug. I'm thinking, this is good, this is all right. And he's happy, and I get the kiss on the cheek, and we're right. And I said to Johan afterwards, I said, mate, what was all that about? And he said he was worried you were English. There's a modern day image, and also a little image of the trench map of that time, which shows us we're on the right spot. The little blue circle is about where we think Tiny should be. The only variation would be the doubt we have to potentially finding him is that his mates may not have had time to bury him deep enough, knowing the Germans were 2 kilometres away and they were within range of machine gun and rifle fire. Would they have time to bury him deep enough? That would have protected Tiny from the plough in the years to come. We won't know until we do some more work. Again, earlier trench maps confirming the headquarters. You walk the ground, you know you're in the right place, which is great. It's taken us a long time to get all these pieces together. And that's in the field looking back. That building was the Allied headquarters there for much of the First World War. And I think we are just about on the spot where young Tiny was laid to rest by his mates. And interestingly, when I met with Leslie the first time and explained the story, I didn't have these pictures. I knew the area, I had been there, but I didn't have pictures. And I said to Leslie, I think we can find him. If I go back, I said, I think we can find him. And she goes, I don't know, Dean. She goes, he's a long time ago, he's sort of laid to rest. I don't like the idea of disturbing him. And I said, well, you're the next of kin. And I said, I respect your wishes completely. If you don't want to go any further, I understand that. And next time I went over, and I did some other research, I went back to where Tiny was. I go every time I'm there. I took that photo. It was a miserable, cold day. And when I came back and met with Leslie again, I said, Leslie, this is where his mates buried him on that field on his own. He has not got his identity back. He isn't buried with his mates. And she said, I'd love you to find him. And I said, yeah, he should be in a Commonwealth War Grave cemetery that is so beautifully kept. And give him back his identity, because I think that any soldier who fights for this country or answers the call of this country should never be forgotten. And if we can find them, I think we should. And I think Tiny deserves that. So we were able to, I think we're looking to the University of Ghent to help us do some ground penetrating radar research. But I think the amazing thing about Tiny, he's unfinished business. I want to find him. And it's not just about one digger, it's kind of about them all. There's so many of these boys missing with no known graves. Many of them had known graves. More time, more research, more effort would be great. The Australian government doesn't really want to know. They say, yes, we should find everyone who fought for our country and has no known grave, but there isn't any support or funding for that. There is plenty of obstacles they'll put in your way. So with some perseverance, I would love to think that we could get a story where Leslie goes to a resting place and sees Tiny Falloon, given back his identity and his dignity, and buried with his mates. For a whole lot of reasons. His story is, I think, a lovely story. The love of a sister. And when we think about, well, it was World War I, does it kind of really matter anymore? It sure does. Because Leslie Falloon matters, and it matters to her family. I think it matters to you. You wouldn't be here tonight if it didn't. I think Australians are understanding what remembrance is even better and better. So that's a little bit of a story about just one digger. But he's pretty special to me. And as someone said, you really shouldn't scare the grandchildren, but you kind of understand why. So I hope you don't mind. That's just one man and just one wonderful painting that George has done, and hopefully that personalises it just a little bit. Thank you very much.
I suppose, George, the first one is, how did you select these soldiers that are so magnificently displayed?
Right. Well, I guess, first of all, coming across Ross's magnificent book, I read it a couple of times and sort of read the stories, looked at the photos, and I thought, well, what can I do with these? And every shot warranted a painting. Some of them sort of really caught my eye, and I guess Tiny was one of them that really struck me. George Gilbert, the chap over there, the sad eyes, has a very sad story. Mr. Valentine, Angus over there with the cigarette hanging out of his mouth. Thought he was a pretty cool dude. He's worthy of a photograph for sure. Walter Spencer, the red background, his eyes told me a lot. He would have seen a lot of misery and death, so he was certainly, there's a story there, that's for sure. I look at some of these. Jim Holland, happy looking chap over here, he was sort of worthy of a story. Then we later found out his granddaughter is Val Lehman, the actress, Australian actress, so that was of interest as well. A lot of the soldiers here are also unidentified. The chap with the trumpet, not a bugle, the trumpet, unidentified. Joseph Wood, the chap over there, he lost his leg. He was known as the limbless soldier. He was certainly worthy of a story. Edmund Lewis, the older chap over there, there's a lot of history. There's a little placard on the bottom there. There's a really interesting story about him. And I strongly recommend, if you're interested in this whole Vineyard Call story, buy the book. It's a magnificent book and explains his story as to why that board is at his feet. And there's about 5 soldiers here unknown, and we've just put some general copy next to their names, but I'm sure there's magnificent stories behind all those young guys as well. Yeah, look, it was pretty easy actually.
George, how did you, can you explain briefly how you actually did the paintings?
Right. I was fortunate enough to make contact with Ross Coulthard, who was fantastic and very encouraging. He was good enough to send me some high-res images of most of these guys, so I worked from a high-resolution image. Worked on the face mainly at the start. It was sort of very important that we get the face right. My background is basically sort of an abstract artist, and portraits were not something I would normally do, but because I sort of love this World War I history, I thought, no, I've got to do some of this sort of stuff. So I've incorporated a little bit of abstract to the paintings, but the faces were very important. So we got the faces right, then I sort of went to town a little bit and just tried to sort of mix them up a bit and make them have their own little personality, I guess. So that's sort of really how it started. Yeah.
I suppose also, George, is where are the artwork going to tour from here, and what's there in plans?
Well, I believe we're going to Sydney next week. We've got a couple of shows in Sydney. Then we go to Adelaide the week after. Then after that, there's a couple of things planned, but not 100% sure where they go after that. But that's sort of the plan at this stage. Now, can I just sort of say something? Dean Miles, it's a magnificent story. I've heard it a number of times. It just gets better and better. Thank you, Dean. Great story. Thank you so much, and thank you for your support too. He's one of my favourites as well.
Thank you, George.
Okay.
We'll thank George and Dean in a minute more formally. Thank you. So with that, I'd like to hand over to the final thank you.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks for presiding over proceedings tonight. Thanks, George, for sharing your insights, and thanks particularly, Dean, for sharing the story of Tiny. I was in the front row there while you were talking, and I could swear that Tiny was looking straight at me, saying, "Listen to this fella talk." So it was very moving. I hope everyone enjoyed the stories that were told tonight, and will enjoy viewing the paintings as well. Feel free to walk around and experience the paintings. George will be around to answer any questions, and I'm hoping that Dean will hang around for a little while as well to answer your questions. Please enjoy our hospitality this evening.